the sunshine. Sorry for being a typical British person speaking English and expecting you all to listen. So sorry about that. Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference, and thank you for the opportunity to not only share some ideas but to learn from colleagues. We're doing that particular in the session this morning when we talked together. So what I want to do this morning is to give you a taste of critical disability studies, kind of past and present. So I have three aims. The first is to consider some of the kind of established approaches to disability studies, many of which I'm assuming that you will know about, and they are the social model, the minority model, the relational model, and the cultural model. Then what I'm going to do is introduce what I'm calling a critical disability studies perspective. And I think, going back to what the Dean was saying there about special education and disability, I think that is a space we might call critical. And then, if I have time, and I might run out of time, so I might have to present through the medium of dance rather than talk, four emerging approaches in critical disability studies, namely CRIP studies, Global South studies, critical studies of ableism, and this word, which I found from talking to the translators, is very impossible to translate, but we'll explain. Basically, dis/ability, where we look at disability and ability together. Is that okay? Some very nice smiling faces here in Australia. Thank you. Okay, so there are, it would appear to me to be four established models within disability studies. And no surprise, many of these ideas have developed in Western Europe and North America. So straight away we can suggest there might be some cultural imperialism and colonialization around those ideas. And we need to keep those kind of critical ideas in mind. But these four approaches, which I'll say a little bit more about, as I'm sure we all know in this room, are responses to dominant ideas around disability that still are written onto our bodies and threaten to colonize our minds. And these we might call moral, individual, and medical models. The first approach then is that of the British social model of disability. When Prince William married Kate in the royal wedding in London, my partner Rebecca and I took our children on that day to go and visit Karl Marx. And I do recognise that maybe Karl Marx might have a very different cachet here than he might in North London. Some would say very radically different. For us, however, it was a reminder that as Britain was getting caught up in this excitement around its own monarchy, that it was forgetting that Britain lives in a deeply unequal society. And the celebration of the monarchy, so it seemed to myself and my partner Rebecca, was kind of forgetting that. So we took our daughters, that's Ruby on the right and Rosa on the left. We took them to visit Karl for the day. They weren't happy, they wanted to stay at the wedding party, but we made them come. Now, I present this image not to necessarily push for communist ideas, but I do think it's important that what the social model did and continues to do, is to give us a materialist legacy, where materialism recognises that there are very real inequities between people based around class, around labour, around human worth. And for us, the social model has been absolutely important. It's been a starting point in responding to dominant ideas. The second established model that I'm sure you're aware of is what's been defined as the US minority model. And the minority model helped to coin this phrase, nothing about us without us. And was very much a North American response to the exclusion of disabled people that learnt much from the Black Civil Rights movement. And as we know, disabled people, for example, in North America, constitute the biggest minority group. And in identifying their minority status, disabled people, of course, have called for various things such as anti-discriminatory legislation. Tied to that has been peaceful protest, chaining oneself to inaccessible buses, a body politic, a politics through the body. And the minority model continues to have massive influences on how we might think of disability. The third established model is that which has been termed the Nordic relational model. So, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland and so on. Scholars and activists have got together through a variety of conferences like this, and it has been argued that there is now a model that has emerged around disability that has emerged from and recognises the Nordic context. Now, what do we know about Nordic countries? The first thing we know is that the price of a beer in Nordic countries is very, very expensive. I once spent £18 on a beer in Norway, and I'm still recovering. The other thing we know about Nordic countries is, of course, their welfare systems. But the welfare systems, traditionally in Nordic countries, are held up as some of the best in the world. Perhaps not surprisingly then, a lot of Nordic, not all, but a lot of Nordic disability studies has tried to interrogate the ways in which services and welfare can support disabled people better. And a word I'm sure you've all heard of, normalisation, from Wolfensberger. Let's just be honest, that's the greatest name of anyone that's ever lived. Wouldn't you just love to be called Wolfensberger? Imagine the email address. Okay, and this normalisation is symptomatic, if you like, or characterises the relational model's idea that disability reflects the fit of impairment to the environment. When somebody feels they do not fit, they can feel disabled. The Nordic relational model is the model that's used by the World Health Organization and was used in the recent World Report on Disability. And it's become very influential. And finally, the fourth established approach within disability, we might call the cultural model. This is captured very beautifully by the work of David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder in their text, Narrative Prosthesis. These scholars are interested in the ways in which culture speaks of disability, and more than that, culture relies upon disability to work. If we look at filmmaking, we find that disabled people are everywhere in films, which is kind of ironic when historically disabled people have been excluded from communities. I wonder if you can spot the character here from a Bond movie. Bond movies rely heavily upon disabled characters to convey fear and notions of evil. This leads Mitchell and Snyder to argue that disability acts like a prop, something we lean against to create culture. And in making sense of disability, we allow ourselves to make sense of something called normal. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So there we are, 4 dominant ideas within disability studies. What I want to do now, though, is to build upon those 4 established models and to introduce you to critical disability studies, which is an area that myself and colleagues in the UK and elsewhere around the world have been trying to push forward. And critical disability studies is very pink, as you can see. Or lilac. Lilac or pink, isn't it? Okay, so what do these kind of disability studies do then? Carol Thomas, colleague at the University of Lancaster in the UK, comes up with a beautiful description of disability studies. She defines it as a transdisciplinary space. And I'm going to leave the interpreters to work with that one for a minute. What does trans mean rather than inter? Inter is between spaces, special education, psychology, sociology. Trans is when we start to break those boundaries. So for Thomas, disability studies has transdisciplinary potential. To mess around and to break down borders between disciplines. We find that definition really helpful. So today we are occupying a transdisciplinary space, if we want to, rather than an inter. And disability remains obsessed with understanding and stopping disablism. Disablism, Thomas says, is a form of social oppression that restricts activities and gets into people's heads. And we still know now that where most young people might know of racism or homophobia, they often do not know about disablism. So we have some work to do there. And with Christmas coming up, if you're looking for a beautiful Christmas present for your friends and family to introduce you to the new and old debates, then go no further. than these texts. Beautiful things that they are. So I'm going to be drawing upon these texts to say some more then about critical disability studies. It's my view that critical disability studies do a number of things. Firstly, they're always self-critical. So disability studies does not think, right, this is the answer. It says right now, going back to the Dean's points about science, it's the endlessly reinvigorating ideas. Secondly, they should be applicable, and thirdly, useful. Academics being useful is sometimes not the case. My own mother asks me constantly, when will I get a proper job? Because academia is often not seen that. This critical disability studies is a proper job, hopefully. It does stuff. It should have theoretical depth. The world is a difficult place, a complex place, and we need complex theories to understand that world. But we also need empirical evidence. We need to carry out research. In the United Kingdom, critical disability studies has to respond to austerity. The British government, it has been reported, is currently being investigated by the United Nations for illegal acts in relation to the UN Convention as a consequence of austerity. We know that austerity, the rolling back of welfare, is literally leading to deaths of disabled people. This is an urgent need of critical disability studies. So finally, in our pink critical disability studies, we need a blend. We need a blend of the academy and also activism. Those two things need to come together. Okay, so what I want to do now is to present to you, hopefully in an accessible way that the interpreters do not punch me afterwards, to four new approaches to critical disability studies. And these, I argue, build upon the orthodoxy within disability studies, will then take them into new and exciting ways. And these are CRIP studies, Global South studies, critical studies of ableism, and dis/ability studies. These maybe have the potential to be less Eurocentric, less US-centric, and potentially more inclusive. That's kind of something to debate. Okay, so let's start with CRIP studies. I'm going to be taking bits from the slides, so don't worry about reading all of the slides. I'll just take bits out. Over the last 15 years, there's been a revolution, I would suggest, in disability thinking. And this has come from writers such as Robert McCraw, Kristina Kolarova, writing from the Czech Republic, Judith Santielman, writing from the States, many others. Crip theory has two ideas. The first is that disability is a negative identity constructed for people because we live in a world that might be defined as compulsory able-bodiedness. And we'll come back to that notion of compulsory able-bodiedness in a bit. So the crip theory starts with that tension. But then it does something very interesting. Crip theory argues that disabled people are subversive, are radical, are disruptive, are exciting, are desirable. That disability becomes something to desire. Now, as we know, the idea that disability is something to desire goes very much against the medical model, which views disability as always a problem. Crip theory actually makes the point that disability is a moment of subversion. So, what would that look like in practice? Think about a classroom. A classroom of 7-year-old children. And think of a disabled child entering that classroom. Traditionally, we would view the disabled child entering the classroom as a problem, as a dilemma, or as Rob McCalco, a Canadian writer, calls it, a problem within a problem. Crip theory asks us to roll back and to see the child's entrance into the classroom as a moment of possibility, as a moment of celebration, as a moment of disruption. We know, don't we, that when a disabled child enters a classroom with supporters, all children in that classroom potentially benefit. Crip theory reads that as disability's positive potential. So, to be crip is to desire. To be crip is to rethink disability in terms of its disruptive potential. And that really appeals to me. The idea that disability is something which is positive is a thing that's always been told to me in my research with parents of disabled children. One of the key messages parents have told me is that my child is not a problem, they are my child. And my child is great. Could it be then that disability is something great? Crip theory makes that point. What it does then is that disability acts as resistance in the lands of the normate, in normate homelands. So if anyone would like to put their hand up if they feel they are normal, can we do that? Anyone? Thank God, none. None here. Oh, there's one. There's one. The normate might be challenged by disability. However, in a short while we will come back to the idea that the normal is also something that people desire. Okay, so that's the first kind of approach that I wanted to, new approach, which is around crip theory. The second is Global South Disability Studies. In 2011, the World Health Organization and the World Bank produced the World Report on Disability. The first global document, really, to capture the lives of disabled people. One of the things we've learned is that there are 1 billion disabled people in the world. And something we have confirmed is that most disabled people live in the majority world. And the majority world is, of course, the rest of the world outside of Western Europe and North America. Global South Disability Studies, and I'm thinking in particular about the work of the Indian scholar Anita Gai, colleague and friend writing in Zimbabwe, Sisi Chateka, Australian colleagues such as Helen Makosha and Karen Soldatish, are arguing that we need to recite disability. Disability is not simply or only a problem of rich nations. Most disabled people, like most poor people, live in poorer countries. So, Global South Disability Studies have started to develop, and I would urge you all to visit the free journal, Disability in the Global South, which is edited by Sean Gregg, and it's written in English and Spanish. And in that journal, we are starting to see more and more writing emerging from different locations. So, 3 things to bring out of this approach. The first is the idea that we find more impairment in the Global South. Global South, majority world, poorer nations. We should therefore be making sure that disability studies engages with them. Secondly, we need to look at the localised responses to disablism. How do local communities deal with disability? And this leads to the third point, which is the notion of indigenous knowledge. I'm thinking there of the Linda Tuari-Smith's idea of decolonising methods. What ideas already exist in the world that might be used to contest disablism? One example will be from the work of Sisi Chateka, writing in Zimbabwe, where she talks about the notion of Ubuntu, which is this notion that there is no I, no me, there's always a collective within Zimbabwean culture. So the idea, for example, of any individual intervention, say social work or psychology, in Zimbabwe has to recognise that the collective is more important. Here, she argues, this is a form of indigenous knowledge that has the potential to support disabled people. And it is fair to say that a lot of disability studies for many years has been Eurocentric, Anglo-centric, US-centric. Global South disability studies are intervening in very exciting ways. And of course, these ideas are particularly important today, particularly in relation to migration and to the increased globalization of the world. Okay. The third approach I want to talk about, I've deemed critical ableist studies. The picture on there is of Frantz Fanon, the decolonising theorist, psychiatrist, and general legend. Fanon, in his book Black Skin, White Masks, starts by saying that the black man does not exist. And it's a very, very powerful thing to read in a book. And urged by these kind of ideas, disability studies scholars have started to flip their attention from disability to ability. Okay, so a few months back I went on Google and I typed in ideal man. It was quite interesting what happened. Be careful doing that. I had a variety of conversations with people and a number of dates. You see an image before you of Superman. Is this ideal man? I mean, he's got his pants on over his trousers, which is very interesting. The notion of ideal man, of the citizen that is most idealized, of the human being that we most value, is at the heart of the critical studies of ableism. When I typed in ideal man on Google Images, this was one of the images I got back. It's a very telling image. One assumes that this man has been out to work, probably in some well-paid office job. He has very expensive cufflinks on, just here, and his hair is beautifully lacquered. He's done that thing that lots of executive dads do, where they just stay in work long enough not to have to engage with their children. The child's asleep. How fortunate. Yeah? One assumes from the building that this is some kind of Manhattan loft. And that looks like a very expensive stereo system. That's what I see anyway. The truth is that what we have there might be a modern version of the human ideal at the heart of Western culture. Here we have a depiction of the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, 1490. And one would argue that this idealized image of the human being exists today, though he wears cufflinks and he has a good stereo system. This might be a modern day representation of ideal man. And frankly, I would never get bored of looking at David Beckham. The UK philosopher Alain de Botton has argued that we live in a time of status anxiety. That actually we are in a time where all of us feel our anxiety of not matching up to what it means to live well as a member of capitalism. And in one of my recent texts I've argued that the desired individual of our times is cognitively, socially and emotionally able and competent, biologically, psychologically stable, self-contained, genetically sound, ontologically responsible, sorry translators. This is a citizen that's normal, sane, autonomous, self-sufficient, reasonable, law-abiding, economically viable. Those are the words of Rosie Braidotti. And the desired individual tends to be white, heterosexual, male, adult, living in towns, global citizen of Western Europe and North America. Some critical observers, commentators, have suggested that Western Europe only woke up to the migrant refugee crisis when white children started to die. So here we have what might be called the basis of ableism, where ableism is the production of that idealised citizen. And here, writers such as Fiona Kamari Campbell and Gregor Walbring have argued that we need to turn our attention to the dominant ways in which particular kinds of citizen, or to push it further, particular kinds of human being are valued whilst others are seen as monstrous. And this approach then allows disability to talk with other identities, queer, female, non-white. These other identities are often also seen as monstrous by the dominant human category. So this approach, this idea of ableism, it seems to me is very exciting and important because it brings together, for example, queer and disability scholars to think about how compulsory able-bodiedness, compulsory heterosexuality, compulsory having to work and shop enough, how all those things are rapidly and increasingly framing what we value about human activity. The final approach is one that I'm developing with colleagues, so I apologise, but I'm trying to sell the books for Christmas. Basically, this approach takes from all of these, steals but also references from the previous approaches. And disability studies seeks to keep attention going. And I'm moving my fingers, my thumb and first finger, in a kind of half circle in the style of my friend Tanya Tichkowski. Whenever she speaks, she moves her fingers like that. And I like what she's doing there because she's keeping attention alive. This approach then seeks to understand the ways in which disability and ability are always created in relation to one another, and that each need one another to exist. Let me give you an example. We are seeing, arguably, a narrowing of what it means to be a valued human being. And the valued human being is one who works hard, has a big enough credit card, and shops enough. Let's think about that in education. In education, students are expected to work like entrepreneurs. In the UK, we had a government policy, and you had a number of aims for children from the age of 5 to 18. And these aims would be displayed in the halls of the schools that you would visit. And they would say things like, children should be healthy, children should be safe. And right at the end of the last one was, children should achieve economic well-being. I was kind of excited that my 7-year-old daughters at that time might be given a job. It might actually help. So there's something here about the narrowing of what it means to be a human. And one way of arguing is that we are witnessing more and more ableism. At the same time, we've now witnessed the highest increase in diagnosis of disability labels ever. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatry Association has produced a number of different labels, including a variety of child disabilities. So what we are seeing is a rise in disability too. So this approach hopefully seeks to make sense of the ways in which we are creating disability as well as creating ability. And then in order to make sense of either of them, one needs to think across the two processes. And I thank my colleagues Jenny Slater, Annette Greenstein, Catherine Ruswick-Cole, Kirsty Lydiard and Rebecca Lawtham here. So this approach always seeks to ask what else is being produced other than disability. And it takes up the earlier ideas of Mitchell and Snyder to suggest that disability is produced in order for society to progress. You will be pleased to know the conclusions here. So I want to finish with 3 conclusions. First, that disability studies has never been more exciting than now. And we are in a really exciting time in our history where we have many different theoretical ideas. We can boast research from Budapest through to London, through to Zimbabwe, or throughout the world. We can boast disability studies that's responding to local, national and global concerns. But at the same time, I would suggest that disabled people have never been more at risk than now. When there is economic downturn, when there is conflict, when there is austerity, we will find more disabled people. And disabled people are often the first to suffer those activities and practices. So I really welcome the conference today and your participation, because I think together we really need to keep strong as people interested in disability. And the third and final thing I would want to say is that we should not shy away from difficult conversations, and that critical disability studies is always open to new, difficult, sometimes heated conversations. Historians, medics, psychologists, whatever discipline we're in, education, we'll come with different disciplinary ambitions, and we will come with different practitioner expectations. Well, perhaps disability is an opportunity to think again, to crib our everyday lives. Thank you very much.